Today I wanted to showcase a few of the additional tools in the engine before we get too far into video sequencing and anything like that. So what I've done is I've actually added a couple of additional packs to our setup. So I added 2 free packs. I added the Rural Australia, or actually 3 packs, sorry. I added the Rural Australia pack, which is one of the permanently free collection engine packs, and I definitely recommend checking it out. It is 2.5 gigabytes, but it has some of the highest quality trees I have ever seen as digital models, so definitely check those out. I also added the free for the month horror dining room to the kit, and I added this amazing, also free particles and wind control system. And we're just going to take a look at a few of these different packs in action with regards to the landscape tools and some of the particle effects in the engine. So I'm actually just going to really quickly make a new level, and I'll just use the time of day, and that's really just to have some initial lighting populating. What I'm going to do is I'm going to activate the landscape tools. To do so, you go up to modes and you select landscape mode. Here you can see where the landscape is going to be. This is actually really big. The default size is 8 by 8. This grid is deceptively large. A character would take a really long time to walk all the way across this. So just be aware you don't really need, for this, especially for this particular assignment, you don't need very large landscapes probably. Of course, you could spend some time and do a really huge, immense landscape shot if you desire, but by no means do you have to. The reason I added the Rural Australia asset pack is because it has a really awesome landscape material, which is a special form of material specifically to work with the landscape tools. So you could of course can apply just like a normal, grass material from the starter content, for example, but I'm going to apply a procedural material which is created specifically to be a landscape. And here you'll see in the list I just typed in land, and there are a few of these examples. And you'll notice as I'm mousing over them, if you look at the path location, all of these are from the Rural Australia pack. So I'm actually just going to pick the content 01. The landscape materials are much more complex than a normal material, and you'll see it takes a bit to load, so be patient. Once you're ready to go, you have a size of a landscape you want to work with, you just hit the create button. What you'll notice is that it is totally black, but don't worry, that's how it's supposed to be. What you want to do first, to just populate it with some kind of material, you go into the paint tab within the landscape mode, and you'll see that there are a number of these materials, and these were loaded in directly from that landscape material, which actually has several materials included in it. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pick, say, the grass and fill it with this landscape layer information, which is going to immediately populate my landscape with this material. And if I zoom in super close on it, you'll see it has some really nice texturing applied by default. And I'm actually going to go ahead and populate in a few of these other types of landscape materials. And you just need to associate the particular landscape layers with them. It's as simple as just clicking this pull-down menu and selecting the asset available there. Once you do this, I actually have this paintbrush active, and I can just select any of these, which has to load for a second each time you brush that material onto that chunk of the landscape for the first time. But you'll see that I'm actually just directly painting a new material over the top. So you can really quickly just come through here and paint your materials onto the landscape as you so desire. This Australia pack is much more like a desert, and so it will be a very deserty texture. If you adjust the tool strength, it will adapt how strongly that material is applied, up to totally overriding any other material. You can kind of blur them together by lowering the strength, though. And so you can experiment with that, get some really interesting results. And some materials will go, depending on what pack they're from, they may have even more procedural generation built into them, and they could even be populating mesh geometry as you paint the texture. Another thing you can do then, once you have your material set up, or of course you can go back and forth between these two modes, is you can enter sculpt mode. And much like you might in something like SimCity, you can just go through and literally sculpt the terrain. If you press the shift key, it reverses the tool and pushes it down, and just clicking drags it up. So you can also just note you can be really delicate with these numbers. They're very sensitive. If you put it up to 1, it really drastically changes the landscape. In general, I recommend sticking below 0.3 even. And for the most part, I stay about 0.1. Just by clicking and holding shift and clicking, you can really quickly generate an interesting terrain purely from this generic circle brush. There are a few additional tools here though that you can use to manipulate the landscape. Things like noise do exactly what they say, where they just add some bumps and roughness to the landscape. Flatten, flattens, and etc. One of the interesting things you can do with the brushes is you can actually load in patterns into the brush. So for example, this kind of default checker pattern, if I load it in and I start painting, you'll see that that is exactly what gets painted into the landscape. So you can have a lot of fun with that. You can bring in these kind of alpha textures and they will be associated with the brush. You can even grab different textures from, say, the Megascans, for example, and use that to generate your landscape form. So I encourage you to check that out and potentially play around with some of those different tools if you're interested in building out some landscapes. Once we have a bit of a landscape established, this has got pretty crazy, but I think for demonstration purposes it will still be just fine. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave landscape mode and I'm going to enter into foliage mode. So it's in the same place. The normal editor mode is just select mode. But here I'm going to go to foliage mode. And you'll notice I have no foliage added to the list. You can add any mesh to the foliage brush you want. The most normal application of this, of course, is to just grab some different vegetation meshes, right? So trees, which you'll notice that there are a few different kinds of foliage pieces included here. So this icon that has this blue graphic bar below it is the pure static mesh of this tree. These versions of that mesh, though, that have this green bar under them are specially created foliage versions of this mesh. So they've either edited some of the properties on them or how they will be applied, but you can add any of these to this foliage menu. Interestingly too, they have pulled out some of the branches and leaves as a separate foliage piece, which then you could paint onto the ground. I'm just going to, as an example, just load this foliage into the brush, and I'll load another tree from this folder system as well. So I added the large tree, we'll add the small tree, and I'll even add in a log. Just to get a little wild with it, I'm just going to go into the horror dining room, and just to demonstrate, I'm going to also include a chair. And on these different foliage brushes, I'm just going to make sure they are all checked to activate them. And now I have this brush that if I click onto the landscape, it instantly generates that foliage. To erase, you can press shift and click. So there I noticed a few things. One, the density on the brush was way too high. So I am going to lower that, which is up here in the top. These are the different brush settings. So you have your size controls. which is just the size of the brush, and the density. And just like the tool strength on the sculpting tools, the density on the brush is extremely sensitive. So you can even do as low as 0.001 and still get really good results. So you can see exactly what's happening. It has painted all of those different kinds of meshes randomly within my brush region. So you can use this to really quickly populate a map, especially for exterior scenes, things like trees that don't need to be precise in their arrangement. So you can play around with what brushes and meshes are loaded here by just checking and unchecking these different pieces. Say if I want a lot of chairs, and I can just put in a bunch of chairs really quickly. A few things that you can tweak about them that are really handy is here you'll notice that all these chairs are facing different directions. They're facing whatever direction is normal to the surface, right? So these chairs that are on this sharp diagonal are coming off diagonal. If you want them to all be vertical, you can just check this box in this foliage editor details panel that says align to normal. And now all of the chairs I paint will be perfectly vertical. You can also do some other adjustments here. You can adjust the scale range, so you could have it populate meshes that vary in scale from say even 0.5 to 2, and I'll decrease the brush size a bit, but now we can have a little bit of variety in these meshes that we are populating into the scene. You can have some other settings here that are interesting. If you want to paint on, say, a vertical surface, so we come over here to this portion of the landscape, you'll notice that as I'm painting, these meshes do not populate this super sharp slope. I'm going to turn back on the normals. But here, that's because the ground slope angle is constrained by default from 0 to 45. But if I change this to 180, now I can paint on the vertical surfaces as well. Of course, that's maybe not as useful for things like trees, but if you're going for something a little bit more surreal, like a collection of chairs on a wall, then maybe that's useful. You can see how quickly I just generated this really interesting and peculiar landscape of chairs. So I encourage you to maybe have some fun with it, with the kind of narrative you can start to create. What a really simple thing we could do to spice up the scene is we just go to check out. Okay, yeah, so there's no fog in the scene by default, so we definitely want to add in a fog. I'm going to make it volumetric, and I'm going to crank it to like 5, no, 2. We'll make it yellow. Okay. I feel like the lighting is still a little blown out. Okay, well yeah, already we've got a nice surrealist, perhaps dystopic future. Just create a camera, and boom. There's our shot. Slowly panning over this landscape of chairs. All in all, though, those were just some of the quick engine tools I wanted to make sure you guys were aware of. Not that you have to use them, but you may find that those are interesting. In parallel to this, though, I'm going to show you really quickly this awesome particle system setup. So, by default, there are a number of particle systems just in the starter content. For example, the fire, the steam, these smokes, which you could just put into your scene as objects to help generate atmosphere or some particular aesthetic effect. This other setup that I have just brought in, though, has a number of different kinds of particles created into these blueprints. And they have some really nice ones. They have fireflies, which is very small here by default. you can see these are some fireflies, which you can actually adjust a number of the properties of. So we can make them blue, for example. We can make them spawn in a wider radius and make a lot more of them. We can make them larger. So these kind of setups are really nice because they have made all of these properties totally procedural. So you could go through and, you know, you see even it's emissive, which is like, you know, these particles are generating light. So you can go through and tweak all the properties on that. And there are several of these included in this particle control system pack. So this one, for example, is an animation of leaves falling from the sky. So if you're into that, there's dandelions. What's really nice about these too is if you want them to move in a particular way or direction, you can just add this particle wind settings to the scene. And I believe we need to edit the wind rotation. And then we can add some speed to it. And now you'll notice that the leaves and the dandelions are blowing in the direction of that wind that we created. So when I said the Unreal Engine is not a modeling software, I did slightly lie. So you can actually do some light modeling in Unreal. To do so, you have to go to your plugins and you have to add the modeling tools editor mode. This is already built in, but you have to enable it. So you just check this box and then it will prompt you to restart Unreal Engine. After you restart, it will add a new mode to your modes tab. So I've just entered into modeling mode, and if you want to begin with, say, a cube, you can just drag in a box by clicking there and placing it in the scene. It has some additional information you can set here, but for now, we're just going to roll with this. Once you've placed the geometry you're interested in, let's say you want to sculpt it. Before you really get into that, I actually recommend remeshing. So by default, you can see this like light blue grid is actually how the cube is subdivided. I recommend upping that count if you want to do any sculpting or modeling work with it. So I just upped it to 50,000 by adding a 0 there and pressing enter. And if this is how you would like it to be subdivided, you can just hit accept. After you've accepted, now with it selected, you can enter into some of these different sculpting tools. So for example, if you just sculpt, this is very similar to just the default sculpting brush in, say, ZBrush or in Blender. And you could just go around and using the different parameters here on the far left and the different sculpting modes available in the brush types, you can go through and sculpt your geometry. Once you like it, you can hit accept, and boom, you have a sculpted cube. Some really interesting other tools within these are particularly the displace tool, and by default it's set to Perlin noise, but what this is really doing is it's applying an image texture as geometry to this object. So if you come here where it says Perlin noise, if you swap this to a 2D texture map, you can actually just add a texture to the geometry and it will displace it based off of the texture. This works best with black and white grayscale imagery, and as you get into some specific types of texture work, you'll find that there are actually certain texture files that are designed specifically for this. They're called displacement textures. And if I want to add one of those, for example, I have a few of them on my desktop ready to go. I just have them here, so I'm going to drag one of these into my materials folder. Let's see which one sounds good to me. I have this kind of crazy octopus tentacle texture. That seems good. So I'm just going to drag that in, and you'll see exactly what it has done. If you want to just increase the amount that this is displaced, the displacement intensity is one of the options here. You'll notice it isn't perfect, but it's pretty good. If you like it, you hit accept, and it will apply this to your geometry. Now this kind of model will accept a flat texture or just like a tiled texture, probably alright, but let's see. Let's double check and make sure. So I'm actually going to just go to the starter content and try one of the built-in materials. So it did receive that material all right, but if we want something that's got some kind of tiling on it, perhaps it'll be a little messier. Yeah, it gets pretty messy around these edges, and of course the sculpting work was not perfect either. You know, I'm just doing this really quickly. But if you want to clean this up potentially, the sculpting tools have some UV editing tools as well. And just to do it super duper quickly, if you just do the auto unwrap, it will adapt the UVs to the geometry. And just be aware that this is probably not going to be perfect, but it might be good enough for what you're doing. It has some of these other, you know, more default styles of projection, which you guys used before, but the auto unwrap may work for you all right. The only way to know though is to just try it on your custom mesh. In this case, I ended up actually canceling it because it was taking ages. But just remember, that's why these are still considered in beta and experimental, and I didn't mention them at first is because they're not all perfect, but you may give them a try if you want to do some interesting custom modeling within the engine.